Alright guys, boxing gossip here on a cold Monday evening. Apologies in advance for my particularly rough appearance. I'm training for a marathon at present, so just got out for a long run, feeling pretty haggard, but nevertheless wanted to make this video. Do you know what? David Price, people love him, people hate him. Let me tell you, I think David Price, one of the things about David Price, right, is elements to his story are, for me, what makes heavyweight boxing. You've got a guy in David Price of freakish proportions, the kind of guy that if you saw in the street, you'd stop to take a second look at him, he's so big. You've got a guy who hits so hard, a guy with legit knockout power. David Price enters the ring, at any moment he can win the fight by knockout, no matter what the opposition is. But you've also got a guy with immense vulnerabilities. I've said this before about Amir Khan. Price maybe doesn't have the speed and the skill of Amir Khan, but he makes up for that in power. And I think that's why there's so much excitement when David Price fights. You've got that vulnerability, and you know that 9 times out of 10, somebody in the ring is going to get knocked out. And I'm not saying David Price is the best boxer. I'm not saying he's the most talented fighter, etc., etc. What I am saying is that when David Price is boxing, I personally am not stopping to make a cup of tea mid-round. I'm glued to my TV set, and that's part of the attraction to heavyweight boxing for me. I put a tweet out today saying who's going to win, Price or Hammer, and I got a lot of responses. A number of people came back to me on that, and I think that David Price, whenever he fights, there is genuine interest in him, and I think it's partly because of that vulnerability that keeps people glued. And this is a fight people are really struggling to pick a winner in. David Price is a big favourite with the bookies. I believe he's 2 to 5 on. And, when you actually speak to the boxing hardcore, it's quite clearly obvious that there's substantial debate as to who's actually going to win this fight. And whilst this one does have the potential to develop into a bit of a dull matchup, it's also got the potential to stylistically be quite a good clash between two heavyweights in a crossroads type fight, if you like. Because if you were picking a heavyweight to beat David Price, if you were picking a heavyweight to beat David Price, you'd start with someone who carries immense power. And Christian Hamer doesn't carry immense power. But second to that, if you were picking a heavyweight to beat David Price, you'd pick someone who would try and take the space away from him, who would try and get on the inside, get inside the pocket, get inside his jab and rough him up. Because there's that suspicion in most boxing fans' minds, and certainly in my mind, that if you sit on David Price's chest, if you put the pressure on him, if you grind away at him, he's got low stamina, he doesn't know what to do defensively, and instantly he becomes very uncomfortable and is a sitting duck. And surely, given the height and size differentiation, that is exactly what Christian Hamer is going to do in this fight. He's going to try and sit on David Price's chest, grind away, take away the distance, not allow David Price to dictate the fight from range, not allow David Price to throw that long right hand that he throws. And if he does that, it could be a tough night for David Price. It really could be. Conversely, if you look at Christian Hamer and you look at his weaknesses, who are the guys he's lost to? I believe it's Tyson Fury and Mariusz Wach. 2 big, tall, rangy guys, which is a category David Price falls into. The Tyson Fury fight really showed the limitations of Christian Hamer. I know Tyson Fury isn't flavour of the month amongst a number of boxing fans, but if you want to see, true, classy heavyweight boxing, have a look at that Tyson Fury-Christian Hamer fight. The way Tyson Fury glides around the ring on the outside, moving, dancing, jabbing, sort of pot-shotting from range, he really destroys Christian Hamer and stops him. That really is the sort of key blueprint, if you like, to beating Christian Hamer. And for that reason, I pick a number of heavyweights to stop Christian Hamer. Someone like a Bryant Jennings, I think, would make easy work of Christian Hamer. Someone like a Hughie Fury would make easy work of Christian Hamer. Personally, I'd be picking someone like a Malik Scott over Christian Hamer. I'm talking about mobile fighters, fighters who are adept on the back foot, fighters who can jab, score a point, change the reins and get out of there. For me, Christian Hamer, you have to rank him there or thereabouts in the heavyweight division because he's got some credible wins, including Erkan last time out. But stylistically, this is not a hard guy to work out, and for me, this is not a hard guy to beat. And tall, rangy fighters, 9 times out of 10, should be beating Christian Hamer. But with David Price, this is where the fight gets interesting again, because David Price is actually quite rare. You know, I think he's 6'8". I think he's nearly 20 stone. He's an Olympic medalist, but he doesn't really have a jab. I mean, how bizarre is that? Let me repeat that. He's 6'8". He's nearly 20 stone. He's an Olympian, and he doesn't have a jab. You know, David Price's jab is actually worse than mine. And I say that only half joking. You know, it's this ridiculous, pouring jab. You know, it's actually an embarrassing jab to watch. And if Dave Colwell hasn't been able to iron that out in the last training camp with David Price, and if they haven't worked out what's going wrong there and got David Price to commit to that jab, this is going to be a hard fight for David Price, because the key for David Price, if the fight is kept at range and long distance, David Price should win this fight with ease, and he should catch Christian Hamer. But if Christian Hamer could just walk through his jab and just duck under his jab and close the range, at that point, I reckon Christian Hamer actually becomes a 60-40 favourite. I really do. So the jab is a key factor here. David Price is not a young heavyweight. He's not new to this game, and at no stage has he showed that he's learned the error of his ways with his jab. So that is a key question going up to this fight. You know, every time David Price has stood up to sort of top 20 in the world level, he's lost. Let's face it. Christian Hamer is borderline top 20 in the world level. And for me, if that jab isn't there, we could see David Price lose again. The other thing is David Price is very slow on his feet. Very slow on his feet. He is really slow in terms of his footwork, like frighteningly slow. What you saw Tyson Fury do is throw a jab, adjust the angles, pivot, spin round, create distance again. Price is not going to do that. What you need against a guy like Christian Hamer, who's a shorter heavyweight, who's going to be ducking, trying to get in, you either need a ramrod, battering ram jab that's going to keep the guy on the outside and dissuade him, or you need good feet. You need to be able to pivot away. You need to be able to create distance. You need lateral movement. You know, Price, to be fair to him, when I saw him commentating on ITV, he did look in very good shape. Much better shape than I've seen him for several years, actually. So potentially he'll come in lighter. Potentially we'll see him more like 18 stone as opposed to 20 stone. And, you know, if that creates a slightly faster, slightly more mobile David Price, I think that would definitely be to his benefit. What David Price needs to do here is almost go back to his amateur days. Almost consider how to box as an amateur. Win rounds behind the jab, create the distance. If he can create that distance, if he can keep Christian Hamer off him, if he can loosen him up with the jab, the opportunities will come. The opportunities will come. And when David Price lands that big right hand on Christian Hamer's being knocked out. Let's not forget, he was stopped by Tyson Fury, who isn't the biggest puncher in the world. He was iced by Marius Wack earlier on in his career. I have every confidence if David Price lands the haymaker, David Price wins. But those are the two key factors for me. One is the movement of David Price. Second is the jab of David Price. Because those are going to be the key factors in determining whether this fight is fought at long range or fought at short range. If the fight is fought at long range, it's an easy win for David Price. If the fight is fought at short range, I actually make Christian Hamer a favourite, and I think Christian Hamer's style could wear down David Price. In terms of making a pick, it's actually hard. I've considered picking both ways. But all in all, I actually think out of the two guys, David Price has the higher upside. You look at Christian Hamer's performance against Tyson Fury, and it was fairly basic. He is very vulnerable to a taller heavyweight who can box, and that should be David Price's style. And I believe they will have spent their entire training camp working on that methodology. If Price loses this fight, realistically, it's the end of his career as far as I'm concerned. The only way back for David Price would be if he was prepared to be, you know, fighting at the sort of English to British title level if he's losing to Christian Hamer. I don't think he could even make it to European level if he's losing to the likes of Christian Hamer, being frank. So this is a must-win fight for David Price. And I think the tactics to beat Christian Hamer are so clear, so obvious. The blueprint is so laid there that I do think that David Colwell and David Price together will have worked out what they need to do to get the win. And I do think, on balance, they'll do enough to get the job done. I think David Price will be tentative early on. I hope he commits to that jab. I hope he dissuades Christian Hamer by pumping out that jab and sticking it in his face. I think if he does that, Christian Hamer will have to gamble. I think he'll have to get reckless in terms of trying to get inside. And I suspect David Price will find a gap for that right hand and stop Christian Hamer. I don't think Hamer's got the punch distance and durability to live with a guy like David Price if David Price starts landing that right hand. Christian Hamer, for me, is the most winnable fight for David Price in the top 20. He's the guy in my top 20 I'm most confident of David Price getting the W against. So in a sense, it's good matchmaking. Because if David Price wins the fight, he definitely goes into the sort of top 20, borderline top 15 in the world. And I think it's as low a risk fight as you could take to get him into that position. Having said that, there's no such thing as a low risk fight with David Price. And whilst I'm picking him on the balance of probabilities, it's not a pick that I'm going to be rushing to the bookies to support, especially at 2 to 5 on. You know, David Price is a risky proposition. But one thing's going to be sure, when Big Pricey steps into the ring, I'll be watching, I won't blink, and, you know, I'm sure people are going to be interested to see what happens. Let me know your thoughts. Leave your predictions in the comments section below. What do you make of this matchmaking? Please hit the thumbs up button. Please subscribe to the channel. Many thanks for tuning in as always, guys.